see someone standing in a room full of people, contributing when expected, laughing at the right moments, maintaining eye contact. They're not withdrawn. They're not anxious. They're not falling apart. From the outside, they seem fine, capable even, moving through interactions with a kind of practiced ease. But there's something underneath, something they can't quite name, a feeling that no matter how present they appear, they're somehow absent. Not to others necessarily, but to themselves. It's not loneliness, it's something quieter, a sense that they exist in a space no one else can see. And maybe they've stopped trying to explain it, because how do you describe the feeling of being both here and not here at the same time? That's the strange paradox of invisibility. It's not about being ignored or rejected. It's about a disconnection so subtle that most people never notice it, least of all the person experiencing it. They function, they succeed even, but somewhere along the way they learned that being seen came with too much risk. So they mastered the art of presence without exposure. They show up, but only enough to avoid suspicion. They contribute, but never enough to draw real attention. And over time, that protective distance becomes the only way they know how to exist. Psychologists have long studied what's known as social camouflage, the ability to blend into environments without fully inhabiting them. It's different from shyness or introversion. Those are temperaments. This is a survival strategy. People who feel invisible aren't necessarily quiet or withdrawn. They're often articulate, competent, even charming, but they've learned to perform connection without risking intimacy. They've mastered the script of social interaction while keeping their actual inner world carefully hidden. And the thing is, it works, at least on the surface. They maintain friendships, hold jobs, participate in life, but underneath there's a persistent sense of detachment, like they're watching themselves from behind glass. They hear themselves speak, see themselves move, but it doesn't quite feel like them. It feels like a version they've constructed to meet the world's expectations, and the real them, whoever that is, remains locked somewhere they can't access. This pattern often begins early, in childhood environments where authentic expression felt unsafe. Maybe emotions were dismissed or punished. Maybe needs were met with impatience or mockery. Maybe vulnerability was treated as weakness. Children are remarkably adaptive. When the environment signals that certain parts of them are unacceptable, they don't fight it. They adjust. They learn to hide those parts. And eventually, they forget they're hiding at all. Attachment researchers call this adaptive self-silencing. The child learns that connection depends on minimizing their true needs and feelings, so they become hyper-attuned to what others want from them. They scan every interaction for cues about how to be, and slowly their sense of self gets buried beneath layers of performance. By the time they reach adulthood, they become experts at reading rooms, anticipating reactions, adjusting their behavior to fit, but they've lost touch with what they actually feel, want, or believe. What's particularly isolating about this experience is that it's invisible by design. People who feel this way rarely talk about it, partly because they don't have the language for it, partly because admitting it feels like exposing something shameful. They worry that if they say, "I feel like no one really knows me," the response will be confusion or dismissal. After all, they have friends, they have relationships. How could they feel invisible But that's exactly the point. They're surrounded by people who know their surface, who interact with the version they present. But almost no one sees what's underneath. And after years of this, they stop believing there's anything underneath worth seeing. They begin to confuse the performance with reality. They think, maybe this is all I am. Maybe there's nothing deeper. And that thought is more frightening than invisibility itself, because it suggests the self they've been protecting doesn't exist at all. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with this. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. They can be at a party, engaged in conversation, and feel completely disconnected. Not from others necessarily, but from themselves. They hear their voice responding, watch their face reacting, but it all feels distant, automated, like they're operating on autopilot while their actual consciousness floats somewhere just outside their body. Neuroscience offers some insight into this sensation. When we engage socially while suppressing our authentic responses, different parts of the brain are activated. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive control and social performance, stays highly active. Meanwhile, the regions associated with emotional processing and self-reference become quieter. Over time, this pattern can create a habitual state of self-disconnection. The brain literally learns to prioritize external adaptation over internal awareness. And here's where it gets more complex. People who feel invisible often develop a strange relationship with attention. Part of them craves being seen, but another part recoils from it, because being truly seen means being known. And being known means risking rejection of who they actually are, not just the version they've constructed. So they exist in this uncomfortable middle space, visible enough to function, hidden enough to stay safe. This creates a kind of emotional double bind. They resent feeling invisible, but they also engineer it. They want connection, but they sabotage depth. They long to be known, but they carefully control what others can access. And because all of this happens unconsciously, they don't see their own role in it. They just feel the result, a persistent sense that something is fundamentally wrong with how they relate to the world. What makes this pattern so difficult to recognize is that it often coexists with apparent success. These aren't people who've withdrawn from life. They're often high-functioning, responsible, even admired. They meet expectations, they fulfill roles, but internally, they feel like they're going through the motions. There's a gap between what they project and what they experience, and that gap widens over time until they're not sure which version is real. Jung wrote about what he called the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the world. He argued that the persona itself isn't problematic. The issue arises when we over-identify with it, when the mask becomes so convincing that we forget it's a mask. We start to believe that the acceptable version we show others is our true self, and in doing so, we exile the parts that don't fit. The anger, the need, the messiness, all the human complexity that makes us real gets pushed into shadow. For people who feel invisible, the persona has become totalizing. They've spent so long adapting to external expectations that they've lost contact with their internal reality. They don't know what they feel anymore because they've trained themselves not to feel. They don't know what they want because wanting has always been conditional. They don't know who they are because identity has always been negotiable, something they adjust based on context. And the exhaustion of this is profound, even if they don't consciously recognize it. Maintaining a constant state of social performance requires enormous energy. It means monitoring every word, every expression, every gesture. It means staying vigilant for signs of disapproval or rejection. It means never fully relaxing, because relaxing means dropping the mask, and dropping the mask feels dangerous. So they stay tense, alert, always slightly on edge, even in moments that should feel safe. This chronic tension often manifests physically. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, fatigue that sleep doesn't fix. The body holds what the mind tries to suppress. And over time, that suppression takes a toll. Not just emotionally, but physiologically. The nervous system gets stuck in a state of low-grade activation, never quite settling, never quite at ease. What's particularly painful is that this pattern often goes unnoticed by others, because people who feel invisible have become so skilled at appearing fine. They've learned to mask distress, to minimize needs, to avoid burdening anyone with their internal experience. So when they're struggling, no one knows. And when no one knows, they feel even more invisible. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. They hide their pain, which makes them feel unseen, which makes them hide more. Breaking this cycle requires something most people find terrifying: vulnerability. Not the performative kind that's become trendy in self-help culture. Real vulnerability, the kind that means showing up without a script, saying what you actually think, admitting what you actually need, revealing the parts you've spent years hiding, and risking that when you do, you might be met with indifference, or worse, rejection. But here's the paradox. The very thing that feels most dangerous, exposure, is often what creates the possibility of being truly seen. Because as long as you're managing your presentation, you're controlling what others can know about you. And if you're controlling what they know, they're not really seeing you. They're seeing your curation. Connection requires risk. It requires letting people encounter you as you are, not as you think you should be. This doesn't mean oversharing or emotional dumping. It means allowing moments of genuine expression, speaking a true opinion even when it differs from the group, admitting uncertainty instead of pretending confidence, saying no when you want to say no, small acts of authenticity that slowly rebuild the bridge between your inner world and your outer presentation. For many, this process begins with simply noticing the gap, recognizing the moments when what they're showing doesn't match what they're feeling. That awareness alone can be destabilizing, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You start to notice how often you adjust yourself, how frequently you suppress reactions, how automatically you perform, and that awareness, uncomfortable as it is the beginning of change. Because you can't transform what you don't acknowledge. As long as the pattern remains unconscious, it runs automatically. But once you bring it into view, you create the possibility of choice. You can start to experiment with different responses. You can practice staying connected to yourself even in social situations. You can learn to tolerate the discomfort of being seen without immediately retreating into performance. This is not a quick process. Years of conditioning don't dissolve overnight. The impulse to hide will still arise. The fear of exposure will still surface. But gradually, with practice, you can learn to stay present even when it's uncomfortable. You can learn to trust that being known, truly known, is not as catastrophic as you've believed. And slowly, the gap between who you are and who you show begins to close. What often surprises people in this process is discovering that they're more acceptable than they thought. The parts they've hidden, the messy, complicated, uncertain parts, are often what make them human. And paradoxically, when they stop trying so hard to be acceptable, they become more genuinely connected. Because people don't actually connect with perfection. They connect with reality, with struggle, with the awkward, fumbling truth of being human. Still, there's grief in this realization. Grief for all the years spent hidden. Grief for the connections that remained surface level because depth felt too risky. Grief for the self that was silenced before it ever had a chance to speak. That grief deserves space. It's not a sign of weakness or self-pity, it's an acknowledgement of loss. And allowing yourself to feel it, without rushing to fix or transcend it, is part of the process of coming back to yourself. Because that's what this is really about. Not becoming someone new, but recovering who you were before you learned to hide. Before you learned that your authentic self was too much, too messy, too inconvenient. Somewhere beneath the performance, there's a version of you that still exists. Quieter now, more cautious, but still there. And the work is not to create a new self, but to give that buried self permission to emerge. And when it does, even in small moments, something shifts. The world doesn't feel quite as distant. Conversations don't feel quite as exhausting. You start to occupy your own life instead of watching it from the outside. It's subtle at first, but over time the feeling of invisibility begins to fade. Not because others suddenly see you differently, but because you've stopped hiding. You've allowed yourself to be present fully, even imperfectly, and in that presence, you finally become visible to the person who matters most, yourself.